Video games are getting more expensive. With the announcement of the Switch 2, Nintendo has priced many of their titles at $80. Meanwhile, Microsoft has announced that it will be doing the same for its first-party titles. But how do current video game prices compare to those of generations prior, and are they really as expensive as they seem? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look back at video game prices, starting from the early Atari games of the 80s and going all the way to their modern counterparts. And we'll be adjusting each generation's game prices for inflation to see what they would cost today. Now, I'm going to focus on two markets, the US with the dollar because that's the largest global market for video games, and the UK with the pound because that's where I'm from. Now, unfortunately, there is no central database that keeps track of video game retail prices over the years, so I had to look through old Toys R Us, Sears, KB Games, Argos, Game UK catalogs, and website archives to get this information. And so, join me on this nostalgic journey through childhood catalogs and economic inflation as we compare the prices of video games across generations. We begin at the dawn of the home console. In these early days, both the industry and the market were still trying to figure out the prices of these peculiar new novelties known as video games. In 1977, the Sears branded Atari 2600, known as the Telegames Arcade, retailed for $179, with most of the games costing just $20. Adjusting for inflation, that would actually be a whopping $105 in 2025. Here in Britain, Atari games cost £15 in 1979, which would be about £97 in today's money. And so there you have it, Atari games were technically more expensive than Mario Kart World. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, okay, but seriously, those were very early games. Let's see how prices changed as the industry came into its own, with software evolving into something closer to what we'd recognize as contemporary video games of today. Well, the Nintendo Entertainment System saw quite a bit of variety when it came to pricing. Games from smaller developers could retail as low as $15. However, most of the games that we'd come to associate with the NES ranged from $35 to $45. That's about $94 to $120 in today's money. And if you have issues with Tears of the Kingdom for Switch 2 costing way too much, then remember, Nintendo has always done this. But to be honest, it wasn't just first-party Nintendo products. Can someone explain to me why Tecmo Super Bowl was worth $54? That's $126 in today's money. Apparently, it's because this was the first NFL licensed game. Meanwhile, look at the trusty old Master System. Every game is a straight $29.99. Here in Britain, new NES games hovered around the £35 to £40 mark, which would put them around $96 to $110 in today's money. And just like in the US, the Master System games were a bit cheaper at £30. Okay, let's move on to the next generation where the price of games would see another bump up. In the early 90s, new Super Nintendo games in the US would retail around $50 to $55, which would price them around $107 to $118 in today's money. However, towards the end of the generation, some Super Nintendo games were known to creep up to $60 or even $70. This 1996 Toys R Us catalog was charging $70 for Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Now, I know that Toys R Us were known for pricing their games a bit too high, but come on. Even at $65, that would still be a ridiculous price. Add the $60 Madden 97 to that, and you've got the price of the entire console. Super Nintendo's arch rival also made sure to keep its games prices very competitive for that generation. And suddenly you can understand why rental stores were so popular in the 90s. Meanwhile, here across the pond, prices would range between £40 to £50, which would come to about $100 to £127 when adjusted for inflation. But we also had some overpriced outliers. Both of the most popular fighting games of the time retailed at £60 in this 1993 Argos catalog. That's a staggering £158 in today's money. That's only £15 less than this Switch Lite. Speaking of which, at this point in the 90s, handhelds were starting to become really popular thanks to the Game Boy. However, I'm not going to cover handheld games in this video because they were always a bit cheaper than their console counterparts, plus handheld gaming, at least the way it was in the 90s and the 2000s, doesn't really exist anymore, so there's really nothing to compare it to. Alright, let's continue going through the 90s. The next generation did see a bit of a divide. You see, one of the reasons why games were so pricey back then was because they ran on cartridge-based formats which were expensive to manufacture. So when Sony's PlayStation arrived in the mid-90s with its cheaper disc-based format, its new games did see a bit of a price drop. Throughout its life cycle, PlayStation 1 games would usually launch around the $40 to $50 mark, which translated to around $80 to $100 in today's money. Here in the UK, PS1 games hovered between £35 to £40, which is about £81 to £93 in today's money. Sometimes they would go up to £45, like in the case of Final Fantasy VII, but that game did have 3 discs. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about Nintendo, which decided to stick to the cartridge-based format for the Nintendo 64, which resulted in some astronomical game prices that we still remember to this day. This Toys R Us catalog from 1997 is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Here we have the PlayStation 1 games, $39, $39, $49, Independence Day and Die Hard are taking the piss a bit with $55, but oh well. Meanwhile, $60 for Mario 64, $65 for Wave Racer, and $70 for Shadows of the Empire. And if that wasn't bad enough, look, these 3 games are $75. Adjusted for inflation, the cheapest game at $60 would actually cost around $120 in today's money, whilst the $75 game would cost $150. What makes it more ironic is that both consoles actually cost the same. No wonder the PlayStation 1 sold so much more. In the UK, during its launch, Nintendo 64 games would retail around £50. But as the generation went on, new games seemed to lock in at the £40 to £50 price range, which would put them around £93 to £116 in today's money. These very scans are actually from a copy of the official Nintendo magazine that I had in 2001. And I remember looking at all these prices and being absolutely amazed at how these old, jagged-looking games could cost so much more than the sleek new PlayStation 2 games. And speaking of which, by the 6th generation, all consoles had adapted the disc format, which ushered in the age of consistent and relatively affordable video game pricing. Look at this, $49.99 all across the board, no matter the console or publisher. This was also the generation where limited and collector's editions would start to become a thing. Adjusted to inflation, $50 back in the early to mid-2000s would come to about $85 in 2025. The same consistency was also happening in the UK, where new games retailed around £35 to £40, which would cost around $68 to $78 in today's money. And while the rental stores were very much dying at that point, the strong pre-owned market made the value of used games come down pretty quickly. Unfortunately, these prices would see an increase in the following generation. Developers and publishers argue that high-definition games were becoming a lot more expensive to develop, so the standard prices were raised about $10 to $60, which would come to about $90 in today's money. What's interesting is that here in the UK, new game prices would actually stay locked at the £40 price mark, which would cost about £68 in today's money. Also, this is a complete aside, but who else remembers the 360 launch trinity of Core, Premium, and Elite? Which was your favorite ice cream flavor? In the US, the $60 price tag would stay intact for the next generation. However, continuing inflation meant that a $60 game from 2014 would actually be closer to $80 in today's money. Meanwhile, in the UK, we did see our games get a slight bump up to £45, which would come to around £63 when adjusted to inflation. And so we come to the current generation, which itself has seen a transition. At the beginning, many of the games were still $60, with only the biggest AAA and first-party titles daring to go up to $70. However, by the second half of this generation, $70 has very much become the norm for most games from major publishers, and the UK has unfortunately followed suit. These days, some of our prices are eerily close to the US, despite the pound still being worth a bit more than the dollar, and going into the future, it seems pretty certain that the $80 price tag is here to stay. And yes, it is worth noting that there are plenty of mid-tier and smaller indie games which don't abide by those structures and are still really affordable, but when it comes to the big franchises and the AAA games, they do seem to be heading towards that $80 mark. And so there we have it, the evolution of video game prices over the years. And now that we have all the data, let's plot it on a graph all the way from the $20 Atari games to the upcoming $80 Switch and Xbox games. Now, if we look at it like that, it does seem like game prices are the highest they've ever been. But once adjusted to inflation, we can see that we'd need to be getting into the $115 $115 to $120 mark to match the lofty prices of the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 games. However, it certainly doesn't mean that publishers should be thinking of charging anywhere close to that, because today's industry is very different to what it was in the 90s. For starters, the massive growth of the games industry in the past 30 years means that publishers can leverage economies of scale, accepting smaller profit margins per game while still making more money overall. At the same time, the rise of digital storefronts has significantly reduced the manufacturing and distribution cost of games. As a result, you can argue that the cost to produce and sell each individual game has actually dropped on average, even though the overall cost of developing a game is way higher than it was in the 90s. Plus, one could also argue that modern games are filled with DLC, microtransactions, and aren't exactly 100% polished when they ship, something which you couldn't fix with a day one patch back when your game was pressed onto a Super Nintendo cartridge. But that's a topic for another video. In the meantime, please let me know your thoughts on video game prices. Do you think they're too high? Which generation do you think had the sweet spot when it came to price versus product? And who the hell paid $70 for NBA Hang Time? As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to my existing patrons. If you've enjoyed this video, then please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.